watching over me with 2 first-class relics of St. Philomena. I had a 3rd relic, with a document, of course. It doesn't matter if my relics have documents, I will never give them away. I have the documents. Anyway, I gave one of them away. It was from the sacred veil that wrapped her body. Why did I give it away? To overcome avarice, if perchance it was infecting me. I mean, I love St. Philomena. But I still have that relic, even though I gave it to a very good friend of mine. Because St. Philomena is blessing me because that person is venerating her relic and praying to her every day. Does it matter if I have the relic in my possession? No, it doesn't. Anyway, and not only did I give it to him for that reason, I gave it to him because he really wanted a relic. My dog. Look at that boy. Yeah. Gotta show your dog affection. Look at that. Or else he doesn't know you love him. So, some considerations which will incline the will to seek only what is pleasing to God. I know one of the ways for me, without having read this in a long time, is not to get what you want for a long time. Eventually you either stop praying or you say, "Thy will be done, Lord." Now, I'm no spiritual expert. I'm sharing with you the fruits of my gray hairs. And I think many people could benefit if they just listen to the older people with the practical effects that life brings. And so I share them with you. I wish I could talk to the young Spencer right now and go back and say, "Don't do that." But I can't. I'm Spencer, by the way, for those of you who don't know. In order to incline our will to fulfill exactly the will of God, exactly, wow, and to promote His glory, let us remember that He has set the example by loving and honoring us in 1,000 different ways. He created us out of nothing, after His own likeness, and He subordinates all other things to our use. In our redemption, He passed by the most brilliant angel to choose His only Son, who paid the price of the world, not with perishable gold or silver, but with His sacred blood in a death as cruel as it was wretched. I suppose when we think about things that people do for us, we start to appreciate them more. Who couldn't fall for that kind of selfless love? What I just read, right? You think that's coffee, right? You could be wrong. But you could be right. He continually guards us from the fury of our enemies. He fights for us with His grace. And to nourish and strengthen us, He is always ready to feed us with the precious body of His Son in the sacrament of the altar. Do not these constitute convincing proofs of God's tremendous love for us? Who can understand the immensity of His love for such wretched creatures? What should be our gratitude towards so generous a benefactor? If the great men of the world think they are obliged to do something in return for the respect paid them, even by those inferior as to position and wealth, What return ought not the very worms of the earth make when honored with such remarkable love and esteemed by the sovereign Lord of the universe? In particular, we must never forget that His Majesty is infinitely worthy of our service, a service motivated by a single principle of love, whose only object is His will and desire. Last paragraph I'll read again. In particular, we must never forget that His Majesty is infinitely worthy of our service. A service motivated by a single principle of love. That's what we should have. A service that is motivated by a single principle of love, whose only object is His will and desire. So, from what he's saying here, it's a function of justice. What we should do. He's saying this is what is God's due. The opposition within man's twofold nature. That's the next paragraph. And it's 3 pages long. I'll read it, and then I'll end it at that. Remember, the book is called The Spiritual Combat. And so, even though that sounded kind of dry, we are talking about fighting those evil inclinations inside of us that war against our will to do justice. And so therefore comes the combat. Combating self. Ourselves. We are the greatest enemies to our own salvation. Our own will. Didn't St. Augustine say the devil is like a chained up dog who cannot hurt you unless you go near him willingly? He did. Man has a twofold nature, the one superior, the one inferior. The first, the superior, is generally termed reason. The second is called appetite, sensuality, or passion. What I like about this is St. Louis de Montfort says the same thing. And they use different words for it, though. When I heard that Jesus Christ was exceedingly joyful on the cross, and so was his mother when he was on the cross, I said, how could that be? He said, I'm sorrowful even unto death. Well, in our sufferings, we could subordinate our passions to reason and be joyful in the higher part of the soul without mentioning the name of it and the special. I don't want to make mistakes, but that is what the priests told me. Yes, you're joyful in the higher part of your soul. You're always going to feel it. A priest told me in confession something about forgiving others. It was in regard to forgiving others. And he said, you'll always feel an inclination against it or something like that. He said, pay no attention to that. But he said, you'll always feel it. They know what they're talking about, right? Do you realize that a priest is a master psychologist? They never tell you this, but the priest actually knows you better than you know yourself. Because your judgments are clouded by lofty thoughts of yourself. Their judgments of you are reality. So when you tell them something in the confessional, they get the full picture. Assuming, of course, you're telling the truth. The psychiatrist, he doesn't get the truth. He doesn't know jack. You go to the psychiatrist, you give him your side. He's paid to listen. And you know what? Business inclines him to keep his mouth shut. So you can say everything that you want to hear yourself. But the priest, who's been replaced by this clown called the psychiatrist, who is a clown. He is a clown. An overpaid clown. He gets to take the place of the priest. And he doesn't get the truth. But the priest knows your wife better than you know her. After all, she's confessing her sins to him. And the priest knows the husband better than the wife does. The priest is the most intelligent person walking around with all of this information. He's the one who knows the human heart better than anybody for that reason. They are doctors of the soul. Anyway, and you know what? Perhaps I will recount a story that happens to be humorous, although the intention for telling the story is not to evoke humor. It's not. I went to confession one time and wasn't particularly enamored with myself at this point of my life. And I went into the confessional. And I wanted to sound a little different so that the priest wouldn't know who I was. And I gave my confession. And I thought I did a pretty good job. Forgive me, Father, first. Can you imagine this fool going through my sins one by one, like this, and then, of course, I did this, Father. I regret this. After about 4 to 5 minutes of this humiliation, he absolves me, and I start feeling wonderful. I'm ready to walk out, waiting for the penance, and he says, by the way, your candles, they're in the sacristy. They're blessed. Huh? I was so stupid. Excuse me? I wanted to say, what candles? But I just went to confession. You know what I'm talking about? Enough said. He may as well have said, Spencer, do you feel well? Are you laughing right now? I could imagine that you might be. But I didn't tell you this story to make you laugh, although I knew that you probably would laugh. I tell it to you because the priest knows you more than you would like to admit. And it's a good thing, because he can't say anything about it to anybody else. And that's one of the reasons, one of the practical reasons why we go to confession. So the priest can say, first of all, it's a humiliation. That's what Bishop Sanborn told me. It's humiliation. I remember either in a conversation or probably in a sermon, he said, well, you got to get in there and say you did it again. he says it prevents you from doing it again. Sometimes I get the nerve up to say, I'm going in there. He's a human being. He's the one who has the power to absolve. I'm not going to consider what he's saying or thinking. I don't care. I try to think that. In a way, you have to think like that. It's not that you don't care what your priest thinks, but when you mess up, you got to do it. The entire spiritual warfare consequently consists in this. He gives us an absolute. The rational faculty is placed between the divine will above and the sensitive appetite below it. The entire spiritual warfare consequently consists in this, that the rational faculty, where we know what we're doing, where we're thinking, our actions against the moral law, that faculty is placed between the divine will and the sensitive appetite below it. The commandments, the desires. So that you can look up at the will of God and look below where it should be, what you desire. That is the entire spiritual warfare. That the rational faculty is placed between the divine will above it and the sensitive appetite below it, and is attacked from both sides. God moving it by his grace, that's an attack. That's what he's saying. He says it. God moving it by his grace, and the flesh by its appetite strive for victory. Where will you wind up? Depends on how well you do in the spiritual combat. But it is a combat. Soldiers for Christ. That's a term you won't hear in the new church. In fact, a friend of mine up in New York said he went to his post-Vatican II cleric and said, Father, we're soldiers for Christ. The priest, the cleric said, no, we don't use that term anymore. St. Paul uses that term. Why don't you? Don't get me started. Don't get me started on them. They've lost the faith. And now they want to drag your children down. Don't let it happen. Run. Get your running shoes on and run. I did. I ran. Father Austin Titus grabbed me one time in about the year 2008. Spencer, you left the church. I said, I did? Yes. I said, what should I do? He said, well, it's not good what you did. We were standing in the parking lot to 366 North Watchog Road, Staten Island, New York, and I looked diagonally across the street to a building that said Lutheran Church. It was less than 60 yards away. And I said, Father, how many of those people over there left the church? He said, I don't know. You ever go over there and try to convert them? No, Spencer, what are you asking me this for? He said. I said, well, I would bet that half of those people over there used to go here or somewhere else, like your church. This post-Vatican II establishment. And he said, I got him in a corner. I'll recount the conversation. I said to him, Father, I said, do they have to convert? He said, no. I said, you're making this easy. What do I? He said, you left the church. I said, so did they. And then he said, it's 9 o'clock. I'm not exaggerating. It's 9 o'clock at night. What are you doing to me? I said, your Vatican II document, this is what I told him. Dignita, and I don't mean to be pedantic. No. Mm-mm. No. This is reality. I said, your Vatican II document, Dignitatis Humanae, said that I have a civil right to do this. He didn't even know what Dignitatis Humanae was. I'm sure he read it in the seminary, but he didn't know what the heck I was talking about. I said, listen, your place is this place of scandal. People not covering their body. I said, don't even give me this garbage. What else did I say? There was one other thing. I said, do I have to return here to save my soul? That was the first question I asked. He said, no. And then I said, you're making this easy. But then he thought, but you left the church. And that's when I said, and they? What about them over there, the Lutherans? And that's when he kind of said, come on. I said, no, don't. I said, you're starting trouble in my life here. You don't know what he was doing. I can't get into it on this video. Nor do I want to. But suffice it to say that he inserted himself into my personal business. And intellectually, I defeated him within 2 minutes. Yet he didn't do the justice of clarifying with other people in my life that I made sense. No, he unjustly kept that to himself. Though he was defeated intellectually in his reason, he decided not to share that and say, Spencer's right. Even though he conceded that to me in the parking lot of his church. So, was that the only thing? Yeah, he told me come back. I don't know why I got into that, but I suppose if I rewound this video, I could figure it out. Okay. So I like that. He gives us a portrait of the spiritual combat. What is the spiritual combat? It is the rational faculty between the lower appetites and the will of God. And here is reason. When I studied philosophy in college, I remember that Socrates, I was told, believed in the proper order of the soul. And this reminds me of what Socrates was teaching. He also taught the principle of non-contradiction, that two mutually contradictory statements cannot both be at the same time true. I guess Socrates would be a modern-day saint if you consider the new theology. Insofar as today, they would have you believe that what has been propounded by the Roman Catholic Church yesterday is no longer applicable today. Now, recalling from my studies in 2007, when I made the jump from the new church, I recall a papal encyclical named Humanum Generis by Pope Pius XII. And he said, what is propounded in papal encyclical, what is propounded in papal encyclicals, generally speaking, he adds the qualifier. I always wondered, what did he mean by that? What is propounded in papal encyclicals carries with it the force of this: he who hears you hears me. Wow. And I said, the social encyclicals written by the Catholic Church have the force and effect of Christ's own words. Now, you know, Christ said, he who hears you hears me. So, I'm very passionate about this. We're being lied to. We're being lied to. And one of the greatest ways in which we're being lied to is this whole divorce and remarriage thing. I find that most people cannot go it alone. They cannot get through life without conversation from another person, the comforts of another human being, the compassion. And so when you're in a bad marriage, this opens up the segue to adultery. You need somebody. You don't need somebody. In a moral philosophy course in St. Francis College, Brooklyn, Dr. Carpino, I thought he was a good teacher. I really did. He was very witty and very insightful. He said, when you've had a full meal, he said, you're not hungry for dessert, right? This is during class. He said, you're not hungry. You'd be crazy to be hungry after a full meal. He said, but you still eat dessert. And why is that? Because you don't need it. You desire it. I'll never forget that. He said, there's a difference between what you need and what you desire. And I thought that was a great example. Anyway. So, don't let them lie to you. You'd be a fool. So that's the spiritual combat. Reason. And I think that's what Socrates was talking about, the proper order of the soul. Because these people were pagans, and so he was applying reason to subordinate desire to reason. But he didn't have the moral law. He didn't have revelation. And I will leave that up to the priest to talk about whether or not. I heard the best philosopher who credited at least the natural law with being that we should be subordinated to the natural law was Cicero. But I am not a philosopher, and to me, philosophy was always difficult to understand, very abstract. What is this? I remember reading Descartes, and we're not supposed to read Descartes, but we did. Second treatise on, what was it? Meditations on First Philosophy? I forget. But he writes in the thing. He writes in his writing, as I hold this paper, and the professor says, how could he be holding the paper if he were writing on it? I don't know. I was thinking, this is very abstract, you know? It is apparent then that inconceivable difficulties, arise when persons who, during their youth, have contracted vicious habits And they resolve to change their lives, mortify their passions, and break with the world in order to devote themselves to the service of God. It is apparent then that inconceivable difficulties arise when people who during their youth contract vicious habits, and these people resolve to change their ways, especially when they're older, especially when they're married. Forget it. The will is violently attacked by divine grace and by its own sensual appetites, and wherever it turns, it absorbs these withering attacks with the greatest difficulty. This onslaught is not experienced by those... I'm envious of young people. Envy's not good. I'm jealous of them. In a good way. They have the opportunity not to enmesh themselves in bad habits. Give credit to the fathers and mothers who are raising them well. Now, this onslaught is not experienced by those who are firmly settled in their way of life, whether in virtue, by conforming to the will of God, or in vice, by indulging their sensual desires. In the introduction to the devout life, you know what St. Francis of Sales says? If you have contracted a vicious habit of impurity, he said, you are going to need an extraordinary devotion for the rest of your life. Isn't that what they're talking about here? He says, you're going to need extraordinary devotion. You know what I also find interesting in the introduction to the devout life? He says about a woman whose heart has been enamored by a man. She's in love. He says, this is the woman to stay away from. He says she's not that desirable if she's ever been in love and now is no longer in love with that person. That's what he said. That she is not as desirable as the woman whose heart has never been attached. Isn't it? These priests are very, very bright. I mean, very practical intelligence comes from supernatural wisdom, supernatural knowledge, and then the practical fruits are manifold, aren't they? So, my light was just falling down. No one should delude himself that he can acquire virtue and serve God in the proper way unless he is willing to undergo a violent struggle. Now, I'm at 34 minutes. I think I should break at 35 and make a part 2. Who the heck wants to listen to me all this time? They probably won't get through this. They'll probably say, come on, this guy. I'm going to stop it here, and I'm going to pick up on chapter 11 on a part 2, which will probably only be about 5 minutes. I should have paid better attention, and I don't know how to edit videos. I'll see you on the next one.